a sealed will, a vanished heir, and a train that never reached its destination. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Hudson. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? It's your voices that bring these mysteries to life. I can't wait to read your comments. Let's begin. The late summer sun shimmered gently over the hedgerows of Cleve St. Mary, a village so unassuming that any ripple in its routine felt like a full-blown tempest. On this particular Saturday, the annual garden party hosted by the widow, Mrs. Letitia Deramore, took place in the expansive lawn behind the former station master's residence, now handsomely refurbished and occupied by Mrs. Deramore herself. Once the central station of a now-defunct rural rail line, the house stood as a proud relic of a bygone age, much like Mrs. Deramore, who insisted that cucumber sandwiches be cut paper-thin and served on silver trays. Miss Marple had been invited, of course. It would have been unthinkable otherwise. Sitting primly beneath a striped parasol, she wore a dove-grey straw hat trimmed with faded lilac ribbon. To an inattentive eye, she appeared lost in the teacup balanced in her gloved hand. But her blue eyes, though softened with age, moved quietly across the garden, absorbing far more than idle chatter. This year's party had a particular excitement humming beneath its doilies and delicate cakes. Lucian Attlethwaite, the only grandson of the late Sir Hamish Attlethwaite, railway magnate and local legend, had returned to Cleve after many years abroad. The news had travelled through the village like spilled sugar across a picnic cloth. Whispers had followed Lucian's name like shadows. Paris, Morocco, Monte Carlo, debts, drama, and, most titillating of all, a recently executed will. Lucian arrived halfway through the afternoon, the heels of his brogues clicking on the flagstone path, accompanied by a younger woman with clipped auburn curls and an air of faint irritation. She was introduced curtly as Miss Irene Draycott, a business associate, though few believed it. Lucian, in a sand-coloured linen suit, radiated charm like a gramophone tuned just slightly too loud. Everyone noticed when Mrs. Deramore stiffened as she shook his hand, and when Reverend Good fumbled his teacup in surprise. "What a remarkably theatrical entrance," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular. Not long after, conversation turned delicately toward the matter of the will. Sir Hamish's fortune had once bankrolled much of the Southshire Light Railway, including the very station that now stood, ivy-draped, behind the buffet table. His will, however, had been sealed and stored away for decades, a source of endless village speculation. But with Lucian's return, the solicitor, Mr. Jonas Prentice, had quietly announced the testament would be read that very week. If he inherits anything at all, Mrs. Deramore remarked darkly to Miss Cramley, the vicar's sister, "I'll eat my hat and the daisies beside it." As the sun dipped lower, someone proposed a garden game. Croquet mallets were fetched, though the lawn was uneven and too dry. Irene declined with a shrug, vanishing into the house to take a call. Lucian drifted among the guests, laughing a little, too readily, lingering a little too long beside young Polly Denby, daughter of the local physician. Polly blushed. Dr. Denby watched him like a fox sizing up a coop. It was just past 6 when the first scream shattered the quiet. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, came running down the steps from the second-floor hallway. Her apron was twisted, her face bone white. "It's Mr. Lucian," she gasped. "He's fallen. He's dead." The croquet balls lay abandoned as villagers surged toward the house. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, her hand paused mid-motion over her teaspoon. She set it down with care, rose slowly and followed with quiet steps. Inside, Lucian Attlethwaite's body lay sprawled on the polished parquet floor just outside the study. His eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling with an expression of startled surprise. A trickle of blood had leaked from his temple, staining the collar of his cream shirt. A shattered crystal tumbler lay beside his hand. Irene Draycott stood to one side, trembling, her fingers pressed to her lips. I left. Him only a minute. He said he needed a drink, she stammered. Mrs. Deramore stood in the hallway, unmoved. Well, I suppose it was only a matter of time, she said. There was a silence, one that thickened as Dr. Denby knelt to examine the body. After a pause, he looked up. He's dead, certainly, but I would not say from a fall. There's bruising. Here, and the angle of his head. No, I'd like to wait for the coroner. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the nearby drinks cabinet. A bottle of whiskey stood with its stopper askew. A faint ring of wetness stained the desk beside it. But her attention held on something stranger. The window above the stairwell, wide open to the garden breeze. Though the air had cooled, she said nothing. Not yet. The police arrived within the hour. A sergeant from the nearby town took notes, while Constable Wilkes, young, ruddy-faced and clearly overwhelmed, tried to organize statements. Just a tragic accident, muttered one guest. Could have been the whiskey, whispered another. Miss Marple stood in a quiet corner, speaking only when addressed, which was rarely. But already she knew that something had been set in motion. Not merely a death, but a deliberate act, cloaked in timing, silence, and very old grudges. Outside, the garden had grown still. The croquet mallets lay where they had fallen, and the last train that ever stopped at Cleeve Station had long since passed. But something dark had arrived in its place. Tomorrow, the village would wake to whispers, and Miss Marple would begin to listen closely. The following morning, the village of Cleeve St. Mary awoke beneath a pewter sky. A fine mist clung to the hedgerows, softening the edges of cottages and garden gates, but it could do nothing to dull the sharper murmurings that had taken root overnight. By sunrise, every parlour, post office queue, and churchyard path was thick with speculation. Word of Lucian Attlethwaite's death had spread as efficiently as wildfire, and with far greater imagination. He was poisoned. I heard it directly from Mary Finch's sister, claimed Mrs. Prewitt, adjusting her woolen shawl at the grocer's. She said the doctor found bruises, a struggle maybe. No, countered the butcher, Mr. Fulham, with a meaty hand raised for emphasis. He slipped. Tile floor, you know, polished too much. Drunk, most likely. What do you expect from someone who's been gallivanting across the continent? Meanwhile, inside St. Mildred's vicarage, the Reverend Good stirred his morning tea distractedly, the steam fogging his glasses. Lucian always was a spirited boy, he said carefully to his sister, Miss Cramley, who was darning a sock with rapid, purposeful stitches. But to return only to, well, it's almost unfortunate, Miss Cramley sniffed. I never liked the look of him, too much hair oil. And that woman he brought, business associate, my foot. She wouldn't know a ledger if it hit her on the head. Still, said the vicar, one mustn't speak ill of the dead. Miss Cramley paused, her needle poised. I'm not speaking ill. I'm just saying that whatever he was tangled up in, he brought it with him. Down the lane at Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with a folded copy of the Southshire Gazette beside her. The paper, lacking any official details, had settled for a dramatic headline. Heir to railway fortune dies. Mysteriously, and a photograph of Lucian in his school cricket uniform, at least 20 years out of date. The kettle began to whistle gently, but Miss Marple made no move to rise. She sat very still, the fine lines around her eyes deepened by thought. She had noticed a great many things the evening before: the odd angle of the whiskey glass, the open stairwell window, the way Mrs. Deramore had reacted, not with surprise, but with a kind of weary finality. Most of all, she was troubled by the sense of choreography. Someone had wanted Lucian dead, and had timed it precisely, perhaps knowing the nature of the event, the rhythm of the party, the distractions and delays. These things were not accidental. She rose, took up her knitting basket, and slipped on. Her outdoor shoes. It would do to visit the village. At the baker's she exchanged pleasantries with young Polly Denby, who looked tired and unusually pale. "Oh, Miss Marple," Polly said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to think." He was so charming at the party, so full of stories, and then to see him like that. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Trauma can be more upsetting than we often realize, especially for young people. Polly bit her lip. "Father says it wasn't natural. The way he was lying, he thinks someone hit him." "And what do you think?" I'm not sure. But Miss Draycott, she was very cold, even when they brought the body out. She just kept smoothing her dress." Miss Marple gave a quiet hum, a note of acknowledgement rather than agreement. Then she asked a curious question. "Did Lucian say anything about his grandfather's will?" Polly blinked. "Only that it would change everything. But I don't know what he meant." Elsewhere in the village the talk turned ever more absurd. Some insisted that Lucian had never been Sir Hamish's true heir at all. Others claimed he had come back only to blackmail someone, perhaps the vicar or Mrs. Deramore, or even the local solicitor. The pub had its own theories, most of them involving foreign spies, secret debts, or the spectral ghost of a railway tycoon seeking vengeance. Meanwhile, Miss Marple made her way to the edge of the village, toward the modest office of Mr. Jonas Prentice, solicitor and keeper of wills. He greeted her politely, if a little stiffly, from behind a neat desk framed by high shelves of dusty ledgers. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the particulars of the late Sir Hamish's will, Miss Marple." "Oh, no, of course not," she replied pleasantly, settling into the worn leather chair across from him. "I wouldn't dream of asking, but it must be quite unusual, reading a will after so many years. And just after poor Lucian's return." "Too," Prentice pursed his lips. "Sir Hamish instructed that it was to be read only upon the return of his grandson, and he did in fact return. The reading was scheduled for Wednesday." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "But now—" "It is still to be read," he said quietly. "The deceased remains an interested party, even if he cannot benefit from it." Miss Marple nodded. "And Miss Draycott, was she mentioned?" Prentice hesitated. "I cannot say," he said finally, and began fiddling with a paperweight. That evening the official inquest was announced for the following week. The coroner had requested time to review Dr. Denby's preliminary observations and await further examination of the whiskey glass and other items collected from the study. The word foul play was not used, but its shadow lay heavily over every sentence. At Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple added another row to her knitting and stared out the window as dusk began to fall. The garden below was peaceful, the air sweet, with lavender. But in her mind, the image of Lucian Attlethwaite's body remained fixed, framed by that open stairwell window and the unmistakable absence of struggle. She considered the woman, Miss Draycott. A woman with too much self-possession, too much calculation. Was she genuinely shocked by Lucian's death, or had she expected it? Miss Marple also thought of Mrs. Deramore. Her reaction had been controlled, but not cold. It was as if she had seen it all before, or worse, seen it coming. The deeper truth Miss Marple knew from a lifetime of village observation was that people rarely committed murder for madness or momentary rage. They killed for reasons rooted in pride, jealousy, desperation, or fear. And Lucian, with his easy charm and vague promises, might have awakened any of those in a dozen people. She placed her knitting aside. Tomorrow, she thought, she would have a word with Reverend Good. He had been oddly subdued at the garden party, more so after Lucian arrived, and then perhaps she would stop by the old railway station platform, now overtaken by ivy and forget-me-nots. Sometimes the past didn't stay buried quite as well as people hoped. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the hills. Inside, the wheels of quiet deduction had already begun to turn. 2 days after the garden party, the grey weather continued, its brooding vigil over Cleeve St. Mary. The village, still dressed in its habitual calm, now pulsed with uneasy anticipation. Though no formal charge had been brought, and the coroner's report remained pending, the notion of murder had sunk into the soil like cold rain. Life went on. Bread was baked, brass polished, dogs walked, but everything was now touched by the whisper of something darker. It was into this atmosphere that Inspector Crail arrived from the county station, summoned reluctantly by Sergeant E. Burrows, whose experience in such matters had previously extended only to bicycle thefts and the occasional drunken altercation at the May Fair. Inspector Crail was a man of wiry frame and grey suits, known for his unyielding manner and firm belief in what he called the orderly mind. He had no time for village gossip, and even less for intuitive old ladies who asked questions in tones of mild politeness. He began his investigation promptly at the old station-master's house, standing with notepad in hand before the study where Lucian Attlethwaite had drawn his last breath. "The deceased was found here," Sergeant Burrows said, pointing unnecessarily to the very visible patch of floorboards still marked by a faint bloodstain, now cordoned off with a brass-tipped rope. "Face up, glass broken. Miss Draycott said she heard a crash and came running." Crail eyed the whiskey decanter and crystal glasses arranged precisely on the cabinet. Then he motioned to the window above the stairwell, still partially open. Odd to leave it open, considering the draught. Who else was in the house? Mrs. Deramore, Miss Draycott, the housekeeper, and a few of the guests who came in after the scream. No sign of forced entry. No robbery. Crail clicked his pen shut. So we're left with accident or murder. Miss Marple, who had arrived, under the pretext of returning a forgotten knitting needle, stood in the hallway quietly observing. She made no attempt to speak, and indeed Crail barely acknowledged her presence except for a curt nod. She rather suspected he viewed her as one of the many ornamentally curious ladies that populated these sorts of places. Best ignored unless issuing tea. That suited her perfectly. Instead, she turned her thoughts to a conversation she'd had earlier that morning with Reverend Good in the vicarage garden while he trimmed his wilting chrysanthemums. Lucian's return did cause quite a stir, he had admitted, shears snipping crisply through damp stems, especially given the, well, financial matters left unresolved after his grandfather's death. And yet Sir Hamish never revised the will, Miss Marple said mildly. The vicar hesitated. Sir Hamish believed in legacy. He told me once that the boy, Lucian, deserved a chance to make something of himself. I'll let the future find him, he said, rather poetic really, but a dangerous gamble as it turned out. Miss Marple had nodded, then changed the subject with seemingly casual interest. And Miss Draycott. She seemed rather cosmopolitan. She was polite, he replied, though not warmly, but guarded. I couldn't tell if they were companions or adversaries. Later that same morning, Miss Marple took the liberty of stopping by the village pharmacy under the pretext of purchasing headache powders. She chatted with Mr. Larch, the chemist, who had served the town for over 30 years, and knew more than most about who bought what, when, and why. "Did anyone purchase something unusual recently?" she asked, studying the display of violet-scented soap. "Unusual how?" Larch asked, peering over his spectacles. "Oh, I shouldn't wish to intrude," Miss Marple said sweetly, "but I did once read of a case where someone bought a rare sort of tincture, of foxglove, I believe it was, digitalis, used in very small amounts to regulate the heart, but deadly in others." Larch gave her a shrewd look. "No foxglove. But Miss Draycott did request laudanum. Not illegal, but uncommon these days. Said it was for migraines. I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And when was that?" "The day before the garden party. Outside the mist had begun to lift slightly." Miss Marple walked home slowly, her basket swinging gently in one hand. The detail about the laudanum was troubling, though not conclusive. Many people suffered. Migraines, after all. And yet, Lucian's death had involved a sudden collapse, not the sort of thing that normally resulted from a fall alone. When she reached her gate, she found Polly Denby standing nervously by the hedge. "Miss Marple," she said at once, "I need to talk to you. I don't know if I should, but I can't stop thinking about it." Miss Marple led her gently inside, made tea and waited for the girl to speak. "It's about the will," Polly said. "Lucian told me something odd the night before the party. He said the will wasn't what everyone thought, that he had found out about a change, something that would upset people." "What sort of change?" Polly shook her head. "He didn't say. Only that it would be read soon, and that he didn't intend to be generous in silence anymore." "I think he meant blackmail, Miss Marple. He was going to use the will to leverage something." Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly. "I see. And did Miss Draycott overhear this?" "I don't know," Polly said. "But she looked furious when Lucian left me that night. She stood at the edge of the garden with this expression, like she wanted to smash something." Miss Marple thanked her, reassured her gently, and sent her off with a lavender biscuit, wrapped in paper. Then she sat back in her chair and stared thoughtfully at the hearth. Lucian had known something about the will, something significant enough to provoke anger or fear. He had made threats, perhaps lightly, perhaps not, and he had died before the reading. That did not seem coincidental. And yet, there was something off about it. Miss Draycott, if she were the murderer, would hardly have chosen such a public setting, unless she had panicked, or unless she had an accomplice, or unless someone else, Someone more familiar with the village and its rhythms had done it and made it look like the work of a newcomer. She glanced at the small grandfather clock in the corner. Time, she thought, would be crucial. The exact movements of people between 5 and 6 o'clock on the day of the garden party would tell a story. Not the official story, but the real one. And so she decided it was time to speak with the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. After all, in villages like Cleve St. Mary, those who moved silently in the background often saw more than anyone expected. By the third morning after the garden party, Cleve St. Mary had begun to rearrange its daily rhythms around the presence of Inspector Crail and the spreading roots. Of suspicion, the appearance of a police inspector with polished shoes and a clipped London accent had lent the affair a gravity that no village scandal had achieved in decades. People began closing curtains a little earlier, speaking in lowered voices even in their own parlours, and watching one another with new intensity. At the heart of it all stood the late Lucian Attlethwaite, charming, wayward, ambitious, and now uncomfortably silent. His return had disturbed not only the dust of the railway legacy, but also the brittle alliances and well-aged enmities that had lain dormant in the village for years. In the minds of many, the matter of motive began to gather around two figures: Irene Draycott, the sleek and inscrutable companion of the deceased, and Mrs. Letitia Deramore, the station-master's widow, whose animosity toward Lucian had not been carefully veiled. Inspector Crail wasted little time. He called upon Irene Draycott that morning, requesting an interview at the guest cottage she had been moved to on the edge of the village. The cottage, lent discreetly by the Denbys, was a neat brick affair surrounded by rose bushes and silence. Miss Draycott received him in a crimson robe, her hair still wet from the bath, though her voice was dry and precise. "I've told you already, Inspector. I left the study to take a call. When I returned, Lucian was on the floor. I didn't see or hear anyone else." Crail glanced at his notebook. "You were the last person to see him alive." "Evidently not," she replied, folding her hands. "Someone else must have entered. That stairwell window was open, wasn't it? I told him to keep it shut, but he was forever craving fresh air." Crail raised an eyebrow. "Would you say Mr. Attlethwaite had enemies?" Irene gave a short laugh. "Oh, Lucian collected enemies like cufflinks. He charmed people, used them, and left. But he rarely left them empty-handed, which is why they followed him. And you, Miss Draycott, what was your relationship to him?" Her eyes, a cool grey, did not waver. "I was his partner in business, and occasionally in life, but not recently. Did you know about Sir Hamish's will?" "I knew of it. Lucian mentioned it once or twice. He said his grandfather had made it complicated." Crail leaned forward slightly. "And yet the will was to be read this week. And Lucian dies days before. That seems rather fortuitous, wouldn't you say?" Irene's smile was fleeting and without warmth. Fortune is never that kind. When he left, Crail had no firm evidence, only impressions, and those, he admitted privately, were troubling. Miss Draycott had poise, intelligence, and little sentiment. If she had killed Lucian, she would not have done so in such a dramatic fashion, unless it had not been planned, unless she had snapped. Later that day, he called upon Mrs. Deramore, who greeted him with her usual air of bristling elegance. She served coffee in a room with leaded windows and ancestral portraits on the walls, her expression unreadable. "I assume you've come to ask about Lucian," she said, pouring cream with practiced restraint. "Everyone is these days." "You," Seemed unsettled by his arrival, Crail said. Unsettled? Not at all. I was offended. Lucian Attlethwaite was a spoiled, thoughtless man. He inherited none of his grandfather's decency. You had history. She set the cream pot down with a faint clink. My late husband worked for Sir Hamish. There were complications. Financial ones. Lucian's reckless ventures cost my husband his pension, though that never made the papers. Enough motive to wish him harm. Mrs. Deramore raised an eyebrow. Inspector, if you intend to charge me with murder, I suggest you do it now so I may prepare a statement for the Southshire Gazette. Otherwise I'll ask that you not cast aspersions over my gardenias. Crail left a short while later, frustrated. He was accustomed to culprits who broke under pressure. But here, in the genteel soil of Cleve St. Mary, everyone wore manners, like armour. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the station-master's house, not to confront but to observe. She asked to speak with Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, and was ushered into the small kitchen, where tea smelled of cloves and apples dried by the hearth. I just thought I might return the napkin I borrowed, Miss Marple said, placing it delicately on the table, and perhaps ask a small thing or two. Mrs. Finch, a narrow woman with work-roughened hands and tired eyes, looked wary. I've said all I know to the police. Oh, of course, Miss Marple replied, but you see, I'm not looking for facts, only for impressions. You knew Lucian, didn't you, from before? Mrs. Finch hesitated. He used to come when he was a boy, always loud, always in some mischief. Sir Hamish doted on him, though. And now? Mrs. Finch sighed. He was different, cold almost, like someone playing at kindness. Did you notice anyone near the study that afternoon, before the scream? The housekeeper glanced toward the window, her voice dropping. Miss Draycott went in, but there was someone else too. I saw a shadow on the landing above. Could have been anyone. The window by the stairs lets light in, throws shadows. Strange. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And you mentioned to the police? She shook her head. Didn't seem important. They already had their theory. Back at Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple reflected on what she'd gathered. Miss Draycott, so clearly unsentimental, might have held reason, but lacked the recklessness. Mrs. Deramore, proud and bitter, certainly had cause. But would she risk the exposure? And now the mention of a shadow, someone on the landing, unseen, unnoticed. She took out a sheet of paper and jotted 3 names. Irene Draycott, Letitia, Deramore, Jonas Prentice. It was time, she thought, to revisit the solicitor, because the will itself, locked away for so long, might not only hold the motive but the key to who had truly feared its contents. Outside, the wind stirred the ivy climbing over the abandoned railway platform, rustling like whispers across old secrets. The solicitor's office on Church Street was a solemn, wood-panelled chamber lined with case-books and dust. Jonas Prentice, always an austere figure with thinning silver hair and rimless spectacles, had not changed his decor in decades. The brass doorplate still read Jonas Prentice and Son, though no son had ever materialized, and the filing system relied more on memory than method. Miss Marple arrived at 3:30, precisely as she had arranged by telephone. Mr. Prentice greeted her with professional courtesy and a thin smile, gesturing toward the leather armchair across from his desk. I had a feeling you'd return, Miss Marple, he said, adjusting the angle of his desk lamp. You've always had a certain persistence. "I do hope it's not unwelcome," she replied gently. "You see, I find myself quite drawn to puzzles, and it seems this one has cast rather a shadow over our peaceful village." He folded his hands, long fingers interlacing. "I suppose I should not be surprised. Everyone is interested now, even those who never cared about Sir Hamish or his fortune while he was alive." "Ah, but death is so very impolite," Miss Marple said, "especially when it arrives too suddenly for tea." Mr. Prentice chuckled softly, then grew serious again. "The will is, as I mentioned, sealed until the scheduled reading tomorrow morning. But I will admit something to you in confidence. There was a codicil." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Added in the final months of Sir Hamish's life," Prentice continued, "unusual in tone, handwritten, witnessed properly, but buried at the back of the original document." "And did Lucian know about it?" He suspected. "I believe he obtained that knowledge through less than ethical means. He had a way of pressing the right people." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "And does this codicil change the primary beneficiary?" Prentice hesitated, then gave a single nod, quite dramatically. "If the codicil is upheld, Miss Draycott would inherit a substantial portion of the estate. Not all, but enough to alter expectations. Lucian, it seemed, would remain the heir in name only." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "That might explain his restlessness at the garden party, and perhaps Miss Draycott's composure." She knew what was coming, or feared what Lucian might do in response, Prentice added almost to himself. Miss Marple left the solicitor's office with more questions than answers. If Miss Draycott had motive, then so did Lucian, especially if he had intended to challenge the codicil or use his knowledge to manipulate others. But motive alone was never enough. She needed something else, something quiet and forgotten. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed the events of the fatal day, with an embroidery needle in hand and a pot of chamomile steeping beside her. She made a list, not of people, but of places, rooms, hallways, windows, alcoves. The study had been the scene of death, but the shadow Mrs. Finch had mentioned lingered in her thoughts. Someone had moved through the house at precisely the wrong or right moment. Then she remembered the stairwell landing, and more specifically, the window above it. She fetched her own notes from that evening, scribbled hastily at twilight. Broken glass near body, open stairwell window, draught through the hallway. Whiskey glass on the floor. It struck her suddenly, not as a revelation, but as a slight itch of familiarity. The breeze. She stood, went to her own front hallway, and opened the small window above the stairwell. Immediately a current of air swept downward, ruffling the edge of a nearby doily. Now suppose a door had been left ajar, say, to the study, and someone had placed a light object, balanced or perched, a letter perhaps, or a photograph with enough breeze it could flutter down, or be blown away entirely. The idea was vague but persistent. The next morning she called again upon Mrs. Finch, who greeted her with surprise but no resistance. This time Miss Marple asked not about people, but about objects. Was anything moved from the study after Lucian was found? "Anything small?" Mrs. Finch thought for a moment. "Just a sheet of paper. I found it near the umbrella stand in the hallway. Didn't think it was important." Blank. Slightly scorched at one corner, like someone had held it too close to a lamp. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though she smiled gently. "Do you still have it?" The housekeeper led her to a side drawer in the kitchen and withdrew a folded page. It was indeed blank, except for a faint watermark and the burned corner no larger than a fingertip. Miss Marple held it up to the light. The watermark reads, "Clavendon and Sons, bond paper," she murmured. "Rather expensive for a blank sheet." "Lucian wrote something on it earlier that day," said Mrs. Finch. "I remember because he asked me for a fountain pen. I brought it to the study. And then, I never saw what he wrote. He was laughing to himself. Said, 'This should stir the pot.' That's all." Miss Marple thanked her and left with the page wrapped in tissue, her thoughts spinning. If Lucian had written something, a threat perhaps, or a confession, why was the page now blank? Could someone have destroyed the message before it was read? More importantly, why scorch only one corner? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple carefully pressed the page under a warm iron, as she had once done with invisible ink as a child. Nothing appeared. No lemon juice then. But there were other methods. She held the page just above the gentle flame of her kitchen lamp. After a few seconds, faint brown letters began to emerge. Her pulse quickened. It read, "To whom it may concern. If anything happens to me, read the codicil aloud. They'll know why. No name, no date." But unmistakably Lucian's hand. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. Someone had tried to destroy this message, but had done so hastily. The page had fluttered away before the flame could consume it, perhaps blown by the breeze from that very stairwell window. It had survived just barely, and that meant the killer had tried to silence Lucian not only in life but in writing. She sat back, her hands folded over the restored note. The pieces were beginning to shift, not enough to name a murderer, not yet, but enough to know that the crime had not been one of impulse. It had been timed, calculated, preceded by fear. She would attend the will reading tomorrow, of course, but not as a passive guest. She would be listening for reactions, watching, eyes, measuring silences, because someone in that room would not be hearing the contents of the will for the first time. They would be hearing the consequences. The following morning arrived with an unsettled sky. The air held a strange tension, too warm for the season, with clouds low and close to the rooftops of Cleve St. Mary. It was the kind of weather, Miss Marple thought as she stirred her porridge, that made people nervous, as if the air itself knew something was coming. At precisely 10 o'clock, the village's most invested residents made their way to the solicitor's office for the reading of Sir Hamish Attlethwaite's will. Though Lucian Attlethwaite was dead, the reading was to proceed as planned, his name still listed in the testament, his absence creating more questions than closure. Miss Marple arrived just as Reverend Good, Miss Cramley, and Polly Denby were climbing the steps. She noted that Irene Draycott stood apart from the others, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. She wore black, not quite mourning attire, but dark enough to signal careful attention to appearances. Mrs. Deramore arrived last, dressed in dove grey, with a neat black hat and a handbag that had once belonged to her late husband. She entered with the poise of a woman unshaken by scandal, though her eyes, as Miss Marple observed, flickered briefly when she saw Irene. Inside the office, Jonas Prentice had arranged chairs in 2 rows, with a large oak table positioned at the front. Papers were neatly stacked, bound with faded red ribbon. "Thank you all for attending," he began, clearing his throat. "As executor of Sir Hamish Attlethwaite's estate, I am now authorized to disclose the contents of his final testament." as well as the codicil added in the last year of his life. He paused, perhaps for effect, perhaps for conscience. The room seemed to draw a collective breath. The original will, dated 12 years ago, names Lucian Attlethwaite as sole heir, excluding several more distant relatives, and leaving minor legacies to staff, friends, and the parish. However, the codicil, dated 9 months before Sir Hamish's passing, makes substantial alterations. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her hands folded in her lap. She kept her gaze not on the solicitor, but on the faces of those around. Under the codicil, Prentice continued, a trust is established overseen by a private board to manage the remaining Attlethwaite fortune. Miss Irene Draycott is named as co-beneficiary and board chair, with full discretion over disbursements and the authority to act in the interest of legacy preservation. A hush swept through the room. It was not surprise that filled the silence, but a restraint. There were many things not being said. Miss Draycott, Prentice invited. She gave a small nod, but offered no speech, no gratitude. Her eyes, Miss Marple noticed, did not brighten. If anything, she looked weary. "What about Lucian's share?" Polly asked timidly from the second row. "Had he lived," said Prentice, "he would have received a fixed stipend. The remainder would be held in trust." The implication, though not stated directly, was that Sir Hamish no longer believed his grandson capable of managing the estate. Miss Cramley whispered something behind her gloved hand. The Reverend coughed discreetly. Mrs. Deramore, however, remained perfectly still, not a flicker. Miss Marple caught that stillness. It was the sort one developed not from shock, but from preparation. When the reading concluded and polite murmurs resumed, she made her way to Mrs. Deramore, who stood, alone by the doorway, inspecting a dusty shelf of legal volumes as if they held no consequence. "An unexpected outcome," Miss Marple remarked mildly. Mrs. Deramore did not turn her head. Hardly. Sir Hamish was a man who liked control, even from the grave. "You don't seem surprised that Miss Draycott inherited so much. She was the only one still writing to him, wasn't she?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Some say Lucian may have known about the codicil. He may even have intended to contest it." Mrs. Deramore turned now, sharply. "That sounds like gossip." "Oh." "No," Miss Marple said, "merely human nature. If one stands to lose something expected, one sometimes lashes out." Mrs. Deramore met her gaze for a moment. Then, with a tight smile, she walked past her and into the street. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple took a different path, toward the rectory. She had something on her mind that had gnawed quietly since the garden party. The odd discomfort between Reverend Good and Lucian, visible in the vicar's stammer and distant stares. The Reverend was trimming hedges when she arrived. He set down his shears when he saw her and led her inside, offering tea. "I've just come from the reading," she said. "It was rather a complicated document. I dare say Sir Hamish enjoyed that." Good chuckled weakly. He did enjoy his riddles. "You knew him well?" "I counselled him occasionally," Good said. "Not only spiritually. He needed someone to talk to after Lucian's early escapades." "And did he ever speak to you of regrets?" The vicar paused, poured milk into his cup, then shook his head. He regretted only that Lucian didn't grow into the man he had hoped. But he never stopped hoping. Miss Marple waited a moment. "And you, Reverend?" "What? Did you think of Lucian's return?" Good hesitated. His fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. I thought it might heal something, but it did not. The boy, man rather, was bitter, unsettled. He thought the village owed him admiration. He sneered at us all, though he tried to charm. Miss Marple set her teacup down. And did he ever mention something he had found, something that could change everything? Now the vicar's face went pale. Yes. The night before he died, he came to the vicarage, asked for advice, though not directly. He was waving a paper around, laughing, said he had found Sir Hamish's secret. I asked him to explain. He said, I'd find out soon enough. And how did that make you feel? Reverend Good exhaled slowly. I felt something I'm not proud of. I felt dread. When she left the rectory, Miss Marple's thoughts were darker than usual. There were too many with something to lose. Too many who knew or feared what Lucian intended to reveal, and the paper she now kept safely tucked away, the scorched letter, was proof that someone had tried to destroy the last remaining voice of a dead man. That evening, as light fell behind the hills, she wrote 3 letters, one to the coroner, one to Inspector Crail, and one to a trusted acquaintance in London with a knowledge of ink analysis. The next steps, she thought, would involve not just observation, but confrontation, because secrets in Cleeve St. Mary were no longer content to remain buried. They were beginning to surface, dripping with guilt, whispering from behind lace curtains, and lurking in the shadows between inheritance and resentment. And somewhere among them, Miss Marple was now certain, walked a murderer with excellent manners and very poor timing. The morning after the will reading dawned clear. The heavy clouds of the previous day swept aside by a cool breeze that rattled the last dry leaves clinging to the oaks near the edge of Cleeve St. Mary. It was the sort of morning that might have promised renewal, if not for the fresh round of rumours clattering through village kitchens and along the lane. Lucian Atlathwaite had died mysteriously. The will had favoured a woman no one had truly trusted. But now news had broken of something new, something entirely unexpected. A second death. It was Polly Denby who discovered it just before 8 o'clock. She had walked to the old railway platform with her sketchpad, seeking quiet before the day began. She had always liked the hush of that forgotten place, ivy-tangled rails, moss-grown benches, and the ghosts of timetables long expired. But what, she found just beneath the edge of the waiting shelter, sent her running back into the village with a shriek that cut through the quiet like a bell. The body lay half-concealed beneath an overgrown hedge, face down, hands clutching at the grass. A black umbrella beside him snapped open and broken like a wounded bird. It was Mr. Jonas Prentice. The news reached Miss Marple as she was spooning marmalade onto her toast. Within minutes, her hat was on, her coat fastened, and her feet carrying her briskly toward the scene. The station had been cordoned off by Constable Wilkes, who looked paler than usual and clutched his notebook with trembling fingers. Inspector Crail was already there, crouched beside the body as the village doctor, old Dr. Henley, summoned in Dr. Denby's absence, stood nearby. Miss Marple approached quietly, pausing just outside the makeshift perimeter. "What do we know?" she asked. Crail glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Prentice failed to return home last night. His housekeeper reported it this morning. No signs of robbery, no immediate injuries, but this was found in his jacket pocket." He held up a slip of paper in a waxed evidence envelope. Miss Marple read the first line through the clear plastic. "I must speak to Miss Marple. I have remembered something about the codicil. It was never meant to be final. Her breath caught faintly, but she nodded slowly. He must have written that after the reading, she murmured. Crail stood. Indeed. The time of death is estimated around midnight. Weather was dry. No signs of a fall. Doctor believes it was a sudden cardiac event, but I'm not satisfied. His face, there's a look of shock, not pain. Miss Marple studied the ground carefully. A snapped twig near the hedge, a faint scuff on the platform's edge, and a faint trace of mud on Prentice's trousers. Unusual, given the dryness of the day. Do we know why he was here? Crail shook his head. No appointment, no letter, but someone lured him here. Or at the very least, met him here. He paused. Miss Marple, if you know what he remembered, now would be the time to tell me. She looked at him steadily. I suspect, she said, that Mr. Prentice discovered something about the codicil's legitimacy. Perhaps he remembered a detail he had dismissed. Something about the signature, the date, or the witnesses. You think it was forged? I think someone had cause to make it appear binding, and that Lucian may have uncovered that fact before he died. Crail's jaw tightened. And now Prentice is dead. The inspector gave orders to collect the document and sent Wilkes to speak with the housekeeper once more. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked the length of the platform, her mind turning over a growing list of names. Lucian, the codicil, the scorched note, now Prentice. Someone was eliminating the past, and quickly. She returned home by midday, deeply troubled. Her quiet had been broken not by events, but by patterns, deliberate acts masked by misdirection. Shortly after lunch, there came a knock at the door. Irene Draycott stood on the step, her coat pulled tight, her gloves impeccable. But her face was different now, strained, with a flicker of unease behind the sharp eyes. I need to speak with you, she said. Miss Marple stepped aside, gesturing her in. She led her to the parlor and poured tea without a word. I know what people are thinking, Irene began. That I forged the codicil, that I had motive to kill Lucian, and now Prentice. Miss Marple did not deny it. Do you deny it? I didn't kill them, Irene said. But I did know about the codicil. I saw it once, months ago. Lucian showed me. Miss Marple's eyebrow lifted faintly. He said he'd managed to get a copy, somehow, and that it wasn't legal. It was never filed properly. He said Sir Hamish had written it in frustration, and Jonas Prentice had promised never to act on it. But he did. Lucian was furious, said he'd expose it, said I'd regret everything. He was in one of his rages. Miss Marple studied her. And you? I told him I didn't care, that I could walk away, but he didn't believe me. And after the garden party, after he died, I kept silent. I knew how it would look. And then Prentice... She broke off. Her voice for the first time trembled. Miss Marple reached for the teapot and spoke gently. If Lucian found out the codicil was never intended to be used, and Prentice had agreed to keep it buried, someone must have pressured him to change that decision. Someone who stood to gain. Irene nodded slowly. I think someone blackmailed him, and perhaps tried to do the same to Lucian. Miss Marple sat back, her mind quiet but not still. She thanked Irene and saw her to the door. As the light began to fade, Miss Marple penned a short letter, this one not to the police, but to the Bishop of Southshire, requesting records from the church where the codicil was supposedly witnessed. She had a suspicion. A signature forged is one thing, a witness invented is quite another. The web was tightening, but the spider, Miss Marple knew, had not yet shown itself. It was hiding in plain sight, behind kindness, behind grief, behind habit. But it had left too many threads, and she, like any good knitter, knew how to follow everyone. The next 2 days passed with deceptive stillness. The village of Cleve St. Mary wore its mourning politely but thinly, like a borrowed coat too stiff for comfort. Shopkeepers lowered their voices. Postmistresses handed over parcels with downcast eyes. Everyone waited, though none could have said for what. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had not waited at all. Each morning she rose precisely at 7, drew back her lace curtains, and resumed her quiet pursuit, not with magnifying glass or microscope, but with memory and instinct. The letter she had sent to the bishop's office in Southshire had not gone unanswered. It arrived by post just after breakfast on the 3rd day, enclosed in a formal envelope with the diocesan seal. Miss Marple read, it once then again her face unreadable. At last, she folded it carefully and slid it into the front drawer of her desk. She stood and crossed to the mantelpiece, where she took a small silver bell and rang it once, crisply. A few hours later she made her way to the old station-master's house, where Mrs. Deramore now sat alone most afternoons, taking tea in the drawing-room surrounded by photographs of a younger age. The widow greeted her with reserve, though not with surprise. "I thought you might come," she said, gesturing toward the second armchair. "The entire village seems to think you know something," Miss Marple settled with practiced grace. "Only that something has been terribly wrong for quite some time, and not everyone has admitted it to themselves." Mrs. Deramore's hand paused mid-pour. "How very like you, Miss Marple, so delicately worded." "The truth often is," Miss Marple replied. There was a pause as the tea steeped in silence. "I suppose," Mrs. Deramore said at last, "you want to ask me if I forged the codicil?" Miss Marple blinked. "Goodness, no, I don't believe you forged anything, but I do think you know who did." The silence returned, denser now, pulling at the edges of the air. Miss Marple continued gently. "It was clever, really. Lucian, returning after years abroad, rash and entitled, stirring memories best left settled. And then Mr. Prentice, old, burdened with the knowledge of a codicil he was never meant to act upon, a perfect pressure point. I suspect he was blackmailed, or at the very least persuaded. By whom?" Mrs. Deramore's voice was low. "A person who knew how deeply Lucian's return threatened things, not only inheritance but reputation. You see, the original will named him as heir, but the codicil tried to revise that, without full legal standing. The bishop's office confirmed that the supposed witness listed in the church records, a George Elcott, was never ordained. In fact, no such person existed in the diocese." Mrs. Deramore didn't speak, but she turned slightly toward the fire, her profile cast in shadow. Miss Marple pressed on. The paper was real. The signature, perhaps genuine, but the witness was false, and someone knew that. Someone who used that fact to coerce Mr. Prentice into validating the codicil regardless. A pause. "And when Lucian hinted at knowing the truth, when he implied he might contest the codicil publicly, he had to be silenced, not with scandal, with finality." Mrs. Deramore turned back slowly. You believe Irene Draycott killed him? No, Miss Marple said simply. I believe she was a distraction, a convenient one, but she lacks subtlety, and murder, especially the kind we've seen here, requires subtlety. Her gaze fixed calmly on the older woman. No, I believe the true murderer is someone who understands people deeply, who knows how to use silence as a weapon, who lives surrounded by memories and yet holds grudges as if they were pearls on a string. Mrs. Deramore stood. You should go now, Miss Marple. I will, but not before saying what I came to say. Miss Marple rose too, setting her teacup down with care. You were in the house during the party. You saw Lucian alone, in the study. You opened the stairwell window. Perhaps you nudged the whiskey glass toward the edge. A gust would do the rest. And later, when Prentice tried to confide in me, when he said he had remembered something, you followed him. Perhaps you offered to meet him at the platform, just like old times. A private conversation. And there, you reminded him how inconvenient his memory could be. Mrs. Deramore's expression had not changed, but her fingers clutched the edge of the mantle with slight whiteness. You have no proof, she said. No, only a trail of behavior, and now a document from the bishop's office confirming that the codicil's witness was fictitious. That alone may be enough for the authorities to reopen their view. Miss Marple lifted her handbag, turned to go. And just one more thing, she said quietly. The signature on the codicil? The ink is wrong. It's modern. Less than 5 years. Old Sir Hamish has been dead for 6. She left the drawing-room, hearing nothing behind her but the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the faint creak of old floorboards settling in shame. By dusk, the letter and the evidence had been handed over to Inspector Crail, who sat, with a weariness rare even for his profession. He reviewed the page from the bishop, the ink analysis Miss Marple had requested from her acquaintance in London, and the retyped statement from Mrs. Finch about the strange shadows on the stairwell. Deramore, he said at last. I never would have thought, Miss Marple nodded. She mourned the death of a generation. Sir Hamish's dreams died with that railway. And Lucian, well, Lucian didn't just bring the past back. He threatened to reshape it. She couldn't let that happen. You believe she acted alone? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed briefly. Yes, but I believe she thought she was doing justice. For her husband, for the village, perhaps even for herself. Crail stood. We'll take it from here. As Miss Marple stepped out into the darkening street, a light breeze stirred the fallen leaves along the cobblestones. Church bells in the distance rang out the hour, soft and sad. She walked home slowly, her heart heavy, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. Justice had a way of surfacing eventually, but it never came without cost. By the time the sun rose over Cleeve St. Mary the next morning, the news had begun to seep through the village like ink through blotting paper. Mrs. Letitia Deramore, long considered one of the most immovable fixtures of the parish, much like the stone pillars of the church porch or the weathered milestones along the road, had been taken into custody. There was no grand arrest, no sirens. Inspector Crail arrived at the stationmaster's house just after dawn, accompanied by Constable Wilkes and the quiet formality of a sealed envelope. Mrs. Deramore greeted them in her dressing gown, standing straight as a fence post, and offered them tea before she said a word. She did not protest. She did not weep. She simply handed over a small silver key, the one that unlocked her late husband's roll-top desk, where the forged codicil had been discovered, carefully wrapped in a linen napkin. And so, The truth had begun to unspool at last. Miss Marple remained at Hillside Cottage that morning, declining offers to appear at the station or make statements to the press. She had no interest in newspaper clippings or her own reputation. What mattered now was the untangling, the delicate, patient sorting of threads so long woven into secrecy. It was later that afternoon, beneath the creeping golden light of late September, that Inspector Crail arrived at her door once again. "I thought you'd like to know what she said," he began, removing his hat as she welcomed him inside. Miss Marple poured 2 cups of tea and motioned toward the sitting room, where a light fire warmed the hearth and a half-knitted shawl lay folded. "Beside her chair, she admitted it, then?" she asked. Crail nodded slowly. In a manner of speaking, she said she did what was necessary. That Sir Hamish had made a mistake, placing any hope in Lucian, that the boy would have squandered everything, the money, the name, the respect. She said she only ever wanted to protect the legacy and Prentice. Crail exhaled heavily. That was the part she regretted. She said she hadn't planned it. But he was wavering. After the reading, he told her he was going to write to the diocesan office, confirm the witness, put things right. She met him at the station to dissuade him. She said he collapsed suddenly. She panicked. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her face unreadable. "He did not simply collapse, I think," she said. "She likely frightened him into it. Sometimes a well-timed threat can do more damage than a poison." Crail looked at her sharply. "You think she didn't mean to kill him?" "Oh, I think she meant to stop him. Whether or not she intended death is almost beside the point. Her actions made it inevitable." They sat in silence for a while, the ticking of the clock steady between them. "You were right," he said at last. "She forged the codicil. Prentice, under pressure, perhaps under some promise of silence, allowed it to stand. Lucian returned, suspected something, then confirmed it. That blank page, the scorch mark, he meant to expose her, but she acted first. She opened the stairwell window," Miss Marple said, "knowing the breeze would sweep through the hallway. All it took was a slightly unbalanced whiskey glass and timing. A fall made to look like carelessness, clever but not foolproof." Crail leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "What gave her away?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The stillness. On the day of the reading she didn't flinch. She wasn't listening for the contents of the will. She already knew them. And more than that, she was too prepared for Lucian's return. She didn't react like someone blindsided by the past. She reacted like someone waiting for a shoe to drop." Crail gave a quiet laugh. "You really are a terror, Miss Marple," she waved. Fay hand modestly. "Oh, I just pay attention." That evening the news became official. Mrs. Deramore had been charged with conspiracy to defraud, and with 2 counts of manslaughter. Her solicitor, a sombre man from Swindon, issued a brief statement declaring that his client had acted out of misguided loyalty and desperation, not malice. The village, for its part, did what villages always do. It reacted with a curious blend of shock, speculation, and relief. By supper, new theories were already being whispered in the grocer's. She did it to avenge her husband. No, she hated Lucian for some secret slight. "I heard he insulted her years ago. She was trying to preserve the Atlathwaite name, like some kind of steward. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her embroidery and a warm shawl draped over, her shoulders remained unmoved by the talk. She knew the truth was both simpler and sadder than the rumours allowed. Mrs. Deramore had believed in a myth, that honour, once broken, could be restored by force, that wrongs could be rewritten, that memories, when painful, could be papered over with elegant fictions. But the truth, like railway tracks long disused, never really vanished. It merely waited beneath the bramble, waiting for someone to trip. There was a knock at the door just after 8. It was Polly Denby, holding a small parcel. I brought these," she said. "Lucian's sketch. The one I drew at the party. I thought maybe you'd want to keep it." Miss Marple opened the wrapping gently. The sketch showed Lucian as he had looked that day, smiling, head tilted, eyes shaded beneath a straw hat. The face of a man who had never expected to die so soon. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "Would you like to stay for tea?" Polly hesitated. "Just for a moment." As the kettle sang and the fire flickered, Miss Marple watched the girl, her expression softening. "You mustn't blame yourself," she said. "You saw the good in him. That's not a weakness." Polly nodded, tears held firmly at bay. "I just didn't know people could carry so much anger for so long." "Oh, they can," Miss Marple replied. "Anger, shame, regret. They're the heaviest luggage we carry, and sometimes if we let them sit too long, they grow roots." Outside, the evening mist curled along the lane, quiet and cool. And inside, the truth, though painful, had finally settled into its proper place. Autumn settled fully into Cleve St. Mary in the weeks that followed, painting the trees in tones of brass and copper. The hedgerows turned brittle and golden, and the scent of smoke drifted softly from chimneys as the evenings began to chill. The village, as it always had, moved on, not without memory, but with the tidy efficiency of a place used to smoothing over sorrow. The name Letitia Deramore faded gradually. From conversation, spoken only in cautious tones and never too loudly, it was said she had confessed quietly, with a kind of weary dignity, and was awaiting trial in a private facility under the care of physicians and lawyers. Some said she would never see a court, others believed she would not live to, but none disputed what had come to light. The codicil forged, Lucian silenced, and Prentice driven to his grave by fear and manipulation. Irene Draycott left soon after, taking with her the remnants of her so-called inheritance. It turned out the trust created by the codicil was nullified with its invalidation, and though she retained a small legacy from the original will, the fortune she might have claimed slipped away like steam from a departing train. She made no protest. She simply packed her valise and left on the 10:17 to London, watched by no one but the station porter and the village cat. Polly Denby, quiet and thoughtful, returned to her painting. Miss Marple saw her often now, walking past Hillside, cottage with a sketch-pad tucked beneath her arm, a pencil behind her ear. She was changed, of course, but not broken. Grief had deepened her eyes, but not darkened them. It was one such morning, brisk and bright, when Miss Marple found herself seated once again in the churchyard garden, her knitting needles clacking softly. Reverend Good had invited her for tea, and they now sat facing the fallen leaves and the old gravestones beyond the yew trees. "I keep wondering what might have happened if Lucian had never returned," the Reverend said. "Would Mrs. Deramore have gone on living with the truth, buried beneath her carpets and curtains?" Miss Marple considered this. "Perhaps," she said. "But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it is pressed down, especially when there is resentment beneath it. A house can only be so tidy before the dust begins to show again." Reverend Good nodded slowly. I keep thinking of her face during the service just last year, so proud, so calm, I never suspected a thing. Miss Marple smiled gently. We often mistake stillness for peace, but sometimes it's only the kind of silence that comes before thunder. After tea, she returned home to a letter waiting on her doorstep, a cream envelope with the insignia of the Crown Prosecution Service. She opened it carefully and read the contents twice before tucking it away in a drawer with a soft sigh. It was a formal confirmation. The charges against Mrs. Deramore were being officially pursued. Her mental state would be evaluated, but the weight of the evidence, ink analysis, false witness statements, and corroborating testimony left little room for doubt. Miss Marple closed the drawer. That evening, as the village dipped into twilight, she walked alone through the footpath that once bordered the disused railway line. Ivy still clung to the stone pillars, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy dampness of fallen leaves. Here and there, she could still see traces of the past, a rusted hinge, a forgotten sign, the outline of the old platform half swallowed by undergrowth. She paused where the body of Mr. Prentice had been found. The grass had regrown, but a shadow seemed to linger still. She did not mourn for Lucian Attlethwaite. He had been a complicated man, more reckless than wicked, and driven by appetites he could not control. But she did mourn what he might have become, had he lived long enough to shed the bitter armour he had returned in. She mourned more for Prentice, who had carried too much for too long, and who had paid the price of someone else's silence. And as for Mrs. Deramore, she was neither monster nor martyr, but something in between, a woman undone not by malice, but by loyalty, misshaped by pride. Her crime had not been impulsive. It had been deliberate, layered, timed with the same care she had once given her flower arrangements and her annual garden teas. At last, Miss Marple returned to Hillside Cottage. The hearth was warm, and the kettle had begun to sing. She set her coat aside, placed her gloves on the table, and returned to her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically in the quiet. The firelight flickered across the polished mantel. The clock struck 7, in another home, in another time. Lucian Attlethwaite might have inherited an empire and ruined it, or rebuilt it, or simply vanished into the smoke of foreign train carriages and unfinished debts. Instead, his story had ended here, in a quiet village too small to hold so much history. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her thoughts steady now. She had done what she could. The rest, as always, would be up to the world to sort and forget in its own time. The door rattled gently as the wind picked up outside. Tomorrow the postman would come. The baker's boy would deliver warm rolls. A child might play by the river, unaware that anything had ever happened at all. And Miss Marple, in her tidy cottage, would watch it all from behind lace curtains, noticing, always noticing. 3 weeks passed, and Cleeve St. Mary settled back into its seasonal rhythm, as if it had never been disturbed. Church bells resumed their untroubled chime. Children returned to playing cricket on the green, and the grocers once again displayed apples in neat pyramids without whispered commentary trailing behind each transaction. But beneath this surface, calm, a peculiar unease lingered, like smoke that refused to clear. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her garden with quiet diligence. Her chrysanthemums were coming in late this year, and she found the work of pinching off deadheads and inspecting leaves for aphids to be just the right sort of distraction. But distraction was never quite the same as peace, and some parts of her mind continued to stir, like embers reluctant to die. One matter remained unsettled, not Mrs. Deremore's arrest, nor Irene Draycott's departure, nor the ruined codicil, or the death of Lucian Attlethwaite. Those threads, however painful, had been tied, but there was a detail, small but persistent, that had not quite aligned with the rest. The night of Prentice's death, and a single statement that had troubled Miss Marple more than she had let on. She had recalled it in passing while pruning the wisteria. A detail easily lost, and yet now, weeks later, it rose again. "He said he would meet me at the signal box," Irene Draycott had said during their conversation in Miss Marple's parlour. "But I thought he was being metaphorical. The signal box." No one had mentioned the old signal box since the railway had closed. Even the children avoided it, swearing it was haunted or infested with hornets. Yet Prentice had mentioned it specifically. In the note found on his person, "I have remembered something. Meet me at the signal box." Why not the station? Why there? That question would not rest. And so one mist-grey morning near the end of October, Miss Marple put on her walking shoes and took the long path toward the edge of the village, where the old railway line faded into the trees. The walk took her through lanes thick with fallen leaves, the scent of moss rising beneath her feet, past the disused platform, past the broken signpost, until finally she reached it, the derelict signal box, crouched among brambles and ivy like a forgotten watchtower. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the cracked windows. A rusted lever jutted from the floor, and on the far wall old chalk markings had faded into near invisibility. The scent was one of mildew, disuse, and something else. Ink. There was a table beneath the main window. On it sat a cracked inkwell and a pile of yellowed railway logbooks. One of them, newer than the others, caught Miss Marple's eye. She opened it carefully. Inside were pages of dense handwriting, crisp and practiced. It was a diary, but not Prentice's. She turned the cover page and saw the inscription, faint and slanted at a sharp angle. H. Deramo. Signal duty. 1961-62. Miss Marple blinked. H. Deramore. The late husband of Letitia Deramore. She turned another page, then another. The entries were brief, mostly routine notes of train movements, mechanical faults, weather observations. But near the middle of the book, a section had been tabbed with a torn railway ticket. She turned to it. 6 in March, Hamish called again. Says Lucian's money's gone. Wants to rewrite. Told him it's madness. Let the boy go. March. I've only tried to bring light to what prefers the dark. Later, alone again, she sat beside the fire with her shawl around her shoulders, the soft clicking of her knitting needles filling the room. She thought of Lucian's final hours. She thought of Harold Deramore, scratching out a false name in a lonely signal box. She thought of Letitia, staring out from behind the bars of pride, long before they were iron. And then she thought of the railway line itself, abandoned but not gone. The path of the track still curved through the land, even if the trains had long ceased to run. Some lines, she mused, are never really closed, only hidden. And some stories, no matter how quietly buried, will always find a way to be heard. As the clock struck 9, she stood and drew the curtains against the frost. Her cottage was still, the world outside wrapped in hush and ice. But behind her eyes, as always, the small fires of truth continued to burn, patient, precise, and quietly, waiting for the next whisper to rise from the silence.